and sacrifice in this time for the people of this region and for this important task before us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, SG, and welcome also to the honourable members who have just joined us. Today we focus very much on Africa's trade and integration agenda, and Professor Erasmus and I are very pleased to share with you some of the work that we have been doing. I think, as many of you are aware, we monitor literally on a daily basis developments related to SACU, SADC, the other RECs, the AFCFTA, Tripartite Free Trade Area. But increasingly, our attention has been focused also on global trade, governance, geopolitical, geoeconomic developments. Every morning, we open our media feeds and there's always something new happening, so very important. SG, as you've indicated, we are sharing a little bit of a window into Africa, intra-Africa trade from the South African perspective. And we're doing that simply for the reason that South Africa had quite expeditiously released data for the full year 2024. Usually it takes the revenue authorities, the statistics officers, some time before they put the data for a full calendar year in the public domain. But we have secured this data and it tells a very interesting story. As Professor Erasmus has indicated, about 15 to 16% of Africa's exports are destined for other African countries. So that's intra-Africa trade from an export perspective, which means that 84% of Africa's exports are destined for global markets. If we look at a breakdown of that trade with global partners, it is very much concentrated on commodities. It's our minerals, it's critical minerals, rare earths. So it's very much commodity-focused export relationship with our global trade partners. From the Southern African region, there are a range of minerals and metals that are exported. Of course, this sub-region is endowed with significant resources: coal, gold, diamonds, then of course the lithium, cobalt, and a range of the new generation resources that are used in our tech products, the mobile phones, chips, and so on, but also very important in traditional industrialization. We mentioned copper yesterday. It has been for a long time and remains an extremely important input into, for example, the energy sector. It has very, very good conducting properties, so conducting energy, electricity via copper cables and so on is still extremely important. So the reason this region plays a very important role in intra-Africa trade, and as we'll see when we look at this from South Africa's perspective, is the following. This is South Africa's exports in 2024. This is a bubble chart which South African Revenue Service actually produced, and I've taken it from there. And they show our key trading partners. Now, I want to point out on the right-hand side, honourable members, there's a light green balloon or bubble, and it says gold, platinum, and other products. Now, this is a collection of strategic exports. And some countries, and South Africa is one of those, do not always reveal the destinations of those exports. But of course, all international trade transactions are recorded by the South African Reserve Bank. So the exports flow out of the country, and in return, there is a financial inflow. And the Reserve Bank, the central bank, monitors that very closely. But I'd like us to note how big that bubble is. So it's not insignificant by any stretch of the imagination. major export destination is China. And in a minute, we will look at what we as South Africa export to China. United States, and here the geopolitics, the political engagement, diplomatic relations between South Africa and the United States are very much in the spotlight at the moment. So trade with the United States is important, but Germany, the bubble is pretty much the same size. United Kingdom, Netherlands, Belgium. So we see European countries featuring. And as you've mentioned, SG, the meeting between South Africa and the European Commission is particularly important in terms of the future relationship between these important partners. The European Union, of course, important for the continent as a whole, and also for other SADC countries. But then I do want us to note the blue bubbles. And this is South Africa's exports to other African countries. And immediately we see the SADC member states featuring very prominently. Mozambique is now the largest export destination from South Africa on the African continent. Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, Eswatini, Lesotho. And then we move to countries a little bit further away from the neighborhood, we might call it. So our trade on the continent is very much concentrated within the two regional economic communities, SACU and SADC. And this, as we mentioned yesterday, even with full implementation of the AFCFTA, will remain in place. So SACU is a customs union. There is a SACU treaty, an agreement among the member states. Similarly, there is a SADC treaty with a range of protocols, including the Protocol on Trade and the Protocol on Trade and Services. Now, the trade here is trade in goods. We do not have very good data on trade and services yet, and we can say a little bit more about that later. But this highlights how important South Africa's trade with neighboring countries is. And even with full implementation of the AFCFTA, it will take a very long time before these very strong trade relationships are diluted and replaced by trade relationships with countries on the continent that are far further away. And the reason is simple. It is costly to trade on the continent. Transport costs, delays at border posts, the trade facilitation issues, and the non-tariff barriers we spoke about yesterday are the reason why that is the case. So even if the tariffs come down, we recognized yesterday that the tariff equivalent of the non-tariff barriers for some countries will remain a major impediment to boosting intra-Africa trade. It's for this reason that when we look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, we certainly, from Trellix's perspective, put a lot of emphasis on the potential for improving governance, improving customs and border management processes, taking a look at mutual recognition agreements of authorized economic operator programs so that compliant traders are given the benefits of expedited clearance for their goods to move smoothly, seamlessly across borders to the final destination. This will make an enormous difference to promoting trade. But we've also mentioned the caveat, of course, that we need to develop and diversify, expand our productive capacity. We need to produce more tradable goods and services. And this brings, as we mentioned yesterday, the trade and industrial development agenda into focus. the connections between trade and industrial policy. We also recognize that investors will be looking not only at how attractive a potential market is, but they also look at governance issues when they decide on their investment location. So investment location decisions, whether an investor comes to South Africa or Namibia or Zambia or goes to Nigeria, will include scrutiny of a range of very important issues before that decision is taken to invest and develop productive capacity. Very briefly, imports, South Africa imports, of course, a lot from global partners, and here it's not a surprise to see the very large bubble, China. Now, on the one hand, South Africa exports commodities, so raw materials, inputs into global value chains, and it imports, by contrast, manufactured products, so industrial products, consumer products. And I can be quite sure that all of us in this virtual room today will have some products that come from China. India, increasingly important trading partner. United States features. Germany is a big partner. Machinery, capital equipment still comes in quite large quantities from Germany, France. But then we also see new partners: United Arab Emirates, Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Malaysia, Japan, and others. Very important in terms of global partners. And then we look at the blue, so our African counterparts. South Africa does import products from other African countries. And if we take a look at the size of the bubbles, we see Nigeria as the largest one. What does South Africa import from Nigeria? And it's crude oil. Nigeria is seeing quite significant investment into refinery capacity, but it's not all online yet. And so the crude oil that they extract has to be sent out of Nigeria for refinery purposes. And some of that comes to South Africa. Some of that will then be exported back to Nigeria, but also to other African and global partners. Eswatini features prominently here, Namibia, Mozambique, Angola, Ghana, and we can go through the list there. So in brief, this is the overview. But if any honorable members have questions after this, please do let us discuss them. Very briefly, if we look at the percentage of South Africa's total exports going to SACU, then this is a very interesting picture. The most important category of products is machinery. So South Africa actually produces a lot of machinery and equipment, agricultural equipment, and so on. And this is the largest category, marginally larger than mineral products. So very interesting to have a look at the composition. Prepared foodstuffs. Now, important to note that South Africa has an extensive retail, wholesale, transport, logistics sector. And South African wholesalers and retailers are well established across the SADC region, and they are the conduits for exporting prepared foodstuffs, vegetables, and other consumer products. So we start to see how services and trade in goods are closely connected. So the wholesalers, Metro, and many others, and then, of course, the retailers, including Woolworths, Pick n Pay, Shoprite, Checkers, and so on, are well represented across the continent. And they are the means for trading these prepared products and vegetables and so on with our SACU and SADC partners. Chemicals, plastics, rubber. So it's quite a diversified profile of exports going to SACU, but you can see how important these two categories, and let's add prepared foodstuffs because this is an important one as well, are. If we now move quickly to take a look at Africa, so honorable members, I'd like you just to make a mental picture of some of these figures. So machinery, 15%, mineral products, 14.7. Let's see how much goes to African countries more generally. Mineral products increases from the percentage that goes to SACU, 15%, to 19.6%. It's not a big increase. If we think that this is for the entire continent. Machinery, let's just go back. So this is 15.8. Going to SACO is 14.7. So you see how important trade in the region is. And in between the figures for the continent as a whole and for SACO is, of course, the rest goes to SADC. So this gives us an indication, again, confirmation that intra-Africa trade, certainly as far as the big traders are concerned, like South Africa, is still highly concentrated within the sub-regions. This is why SACU and SADC matter when it comes to intra-Africa trade. And we can certainly have a look at some other metrics as well. Trade with the US market, now that there are question marks about the future of AGOA, precious metals, the biggest category. So this includes some of those mineral exports, which are so important in their value chain development products, iron and steel. We've now just seen the focus again, President Trump imposing tariffs on steel and aluminium, as he had done during his first presidency. Vehicles, aircraft, and vessels. This is an interesting one because South Africa doesn't produce a lot of aircraft. It does produce quite a lot of boats. So the boat building industry, for example, in the Western Cape, where Professor Rasmus and I are located, about 90% of the production of boats, and these are some very expensive elite yachts, racing yachts, and so on, are destined for export. And the US is a big market there. So if we unpack some of these categories, then we see how important the various industries are. Destined for Europe, again, minerals, precious metals, vehicles, aircraft. Vehicles become really important in terms of the automotive value chain. So again, we start to see how important the EU, a traditional market, is. Going to China, and this is the one that I mentioned. If we look at South Africa's exports to China, by far the largest, 2/3 of South Africa's exports going to China are mineral products. So it's commodity exports that go into the industrial sector, the tech sector in China. And this is a very large number. If we add to that iron and steel, then we see that there's a high concentration of exports going to China. Of course, we are exporting some other products too, but by contrast, it is a commodity export profile as far as South Africa is concerned to China. Imports from China, on the other hand, imports of machinery have become extremely important. And to some extent, this is displacing imports from other sources. Germany to some extent, Italy, the United Kingdom, and even the US. So high concentration of machinery imports coming from China. Textiles, products of iron and steel, chemicals, and then a very diverse range of consumer products. Footwear, so textiles and footwear amount to about 10% of the imports. stone, glass, and so on. Now, this profile starts raising issues around our industrialization agenda. How competitive are South African producers when we compare with producers from China? And this is quite an important issue, not only in the context of South Africa, but for the continent as a whole. The continent imports a lot of manufactured products, industrial products from China. China's competitiveness is very difficult to match. So to some extent, this is a factor when we take a look at our industrialization strategy. How do we become more competitive? Where should we be focusing our efforts to diversify our industries and our productive capacity when we're competing with some of our large trading partners like China, which are so competitive? So an interesting question for us to have a look at. And that's the brief overview. So it is always useful, honorable members, for us to look at the data, because the data is in fact the outcome of trade transactions between an exporter, producer, and an importer who is sourcing from an African-based producer. And it's an African company that has found a willing buyer in a global market. So we should never forget where the trade data comes from. There are millions, literally millions of trade transactions underpinned by contracts of sale, of supply between the importer and the exporter. And we aggregate all of that data. And this is then the trade data between South Africa and China, as we've just seen. Now, it is at that level of trade transaction that we're hoping that the African Continental Free Trade Area can contribute to reduce transaction costs of trade, contributing to make African producers more competitive, not only on the continent, but in a global context as well. And how can that be done? So what can we expect from a free trade agreement such as the AFCFTA? We have to be cautious in those expectations because there are a lot of other policies and other initiatives which have to support the implementation of the AFCFTA. And for this AFCFTA to be a vehicle contributing to making more competitive trading conditions on the continent, but also assisting with industrial agricultural transformation. So I'll stop there, and then we look at regional and continental levels. And I'm going to ask Professor Erasmus to speak to this slide.
Yeah, thank you, Trudy. This slide very briefly belongs to what we discussed yesterday when we gave an interview of what is going on the continent. And here we are listing some political issues that are relevant for the discussion that we are having. Some of them related to serious peace and stability issues, destabilization of regions. We talked about the position of the youth, the fact that the median age of Africa's population is 19. So we can ask you to look at these points made here and some of the areas that we have and countries that we have highlighted where there are security and stability problems, and they are most definitely in the SADC region as well. The issue about democracy and governance, we conclude with, and it has to be emphasized that stable environments generate the factors and the conditions for unleashing the economic and growth potential. The opposite is true when we do not have them. Next slide, please. Yeah, Trudy, I don't know whether you want to say something about the various RECs that we have on the continent. You want to say something? This is a chart that you often use, because I think we're running out of time. We must get to the text of the AFC-FTA agreement.
Absolutely. Very briefly, honourable members, what we've recognised here is that the regional economic communities on the continent, there are 8 that are recognised by the African Union as regional economic communities, and they are the ones in the block at the top and on the right-hand side. Why we have separated them into 2 blocks is that the ones along here, COMESA, SADC, EAC, and ECOWAS, all have trading arrangements. So EAC and ECOWAS are, at least on paper, customs unions. They are really customs unions in progress. There is still work to be done. Honourable members, EAC, we have to constantly update this map, because in recent years, in fact, since 2022, April 2022, the membership of EAC has been expanding. And this is a reminder that the agendas of our RECs are not fixed. They cover, as we've said, so many different issues, and they have their own trajectories along which they are implementing various protocols, initiatives, and also attracting new members to join them. COMESA, and of course here in the middle is SADC. Keep in mind that of the 16 SADC members, 3 are not yet participating in the protocol on trade. There's work in progress, certainly a lot of good progress underway, for example, with Angola, Comores, but not yet full members of the free trade area. The other 4 regional economic communities at the bottom, the Arab Maghreb Union, SENSAD, this is the Sahel region, IGAD, the Horn of Africa is covered, and ECAS in Central Africa. They do not have trading arrangements. They have other trading relationships with partners. So, for example, some of the countries in the Arab Maghreb Union, they're member of the Grand Arab Free Trade Area, which includes members in the Middle Eastern region as well. ECAS is an interesting one, apologies for that, because included within ECAS is CEMAC, which is a monetary union, which also implements a common external tariff. But ECAS, this grouping of Central African states, does not have its own free trade agreement. The members signed an FTA in 2004, but it's not implemented yet. And then on the left-hand side, we have a reminder that in addition to the RECs recognized by the African Union, there are others. SACU is one of those. It's the oldest customs union, functioning customs union in the world. All the SACU members are also, of course, members of SADC, but it is an advanced integration arrangement, customs union with a common external tariff. And then there are other trading arrangements. There are bilateral agreements between countries that are still operational. And the one to watch carefully is the tripartite free trade area. So this is just a little bit of the trade governance regional integration landscape. Thank you very much, Professor Erasmus.
Yeah, this one is also for you, Trudy, please.
The SADC trade agenda, and honourable members, you are very familiar with this, absolutely sure of that. But just for the record, the trading arrangements that exist continue. And this is a little bit of a summary of where we stand with the SADC trade agenda. So the SADC free trade area was launched in August 2008 at the SADC summit. And a phased program of tariff reductions then followed. And this was quite interesting because the non-SACU SADC countries had two offers of reducing duties, one to South Africa and one to the other SADC member states. And the timeframes are slightly different for those two tracks. As we mentioned yesterday, of course, by 2012, we were all to have completed the tariff phase down to 0. But there were some countries that have experienced difficulties, and so it was agreed that they could take longer. Mozambique had upfront, as a least developed country, requested specifically that its liberalization of duties to South African imports would only be implemented by 2015. So here's a little bit of detail of some of the countries and the challenges they have experienced. We've got to keep in mind that overlapping membership is really important here. So SADC and COMESA overlap quite extensively. Tanzania is, of course, also a member of the East African community. So we've got to keep in mind that member states actually participate not only in the SADC trade and integration agenda, but also in others as well. This is a very brief look at the trade and services agenda in SADC. This is a very important agenda. As we've seen, services play such an important role in and of themselves. Tourism, communication, financial services sectors in most of our countries, extremely important in terms of their contributions to economic activity, employment, income, and so on. But services are also trade facilitating inputs. And of course, very important that services play a direct role in achieving development outcomes. If we think of healthcare, educational services, and communication services, they are extremely important in promoting other development outcomes. So they're also social sectors when we look at economic activity. Now, we started with the phase 1 negotiations in SADC, focusing on 6 sectors. They are to some extent overlapping with the priority sectors in the AFCFTA, as we will see, but they include others, which is really interesting. So communication, financial, tourism, and transport, they're also in the AFCFTA priority service sectors. But SADC has included construction and energy-related services, and I think that's extremely important. So energy-related services, energy security, we don't take for granted in any of our countries, extremely important for industrialization. Construction, very important in terms of infrastructure development, which we mentioned yesterday as well. Very important in terms of development pathways. The Trade and Services Protocol entered into force in January 2022. Actually, here we've got February and January. The texts are a little bit unclear on that, so just read that very carefully. A second round of negotiations is currently underway, and business services, distribution, so this is wholesale, retail, education, healthcare, and environmental services are included as well. So there's work in progress there. Now we're looking at the African Continental Free Trade Area. Professor Erasmus, over to you.
Thank you, Trudy. Honorable SG, honorable MPs, the final third session is devoted to the text of the AFCFTA. Now, I've listened to some of the implications being mentioned by Trudy of the trade data that she discussed with us. And obviously one would, starting from that information, one must ask the question, what are the opportunities for changing that picture? If in a few years' time we again have a meeting like this and we consult the data again, will it look differently? Will the 15% intra-African trade in goods component look differently, and how would it How would it be changed? I also sometimes get the feeling that we look at a trade agreement such as the AFCFTA, which has been launched with a lot of political enthusiasm. And we look at it as our savior in the future. That's the wrong way to look at the international trade agreement. It is not us or the politicians or the governments who must get excited about the potential in a trade agreement. It must be the private sector. It must be the importers, the exporters, the manufacturers, the investors. They must get excited. Only then can the picture change. And very importantly, the consumers must get excited. They must then change their behavior and start buying things that we manufacture at prices that are competitive. So the big challenge for the AFCFTA to be translated from a political text into trade reality, we must be very careful about. What can parliaments do? What can legislatures do in addressing this particular issue? It is one thing to say we must pronounce our faith in the AFCFTA repeatedly, but much more is needed in making sure that there will be conditions in each of our countries and in our RECs and in SADC in particular that will serve as improvements and changes and making conditions more attractive. Yesterday, after we closed our discussion, Trudy and I briefly discussed a report that appeared in the South African newspapers yesterday. And the report says that the cost
to deliver something to you in person.
Okay, may I proceed? Okay, this report says that the costs in logistics-related impediments, logistical problems for exporters in South Africa, that is the transport to the ports and the exports and the procedures that are related, runs into 1 billion rand per day since sometime last year. Now, Trudy can also report, can also help us with interpreting that report, that news item. Who is responsible for addressing that issue? Who's responsible for providing an answer? Is there a regional component involved here? Is it something that I listened to the issue this morning about the important task of parliaments and parliamentarians also in keeping this debate alive and monitoring it. So I'm going to very quickly run through the provisions that we have in the AFCFTA agreement, the philosophy that it contains, the institutions that have been established, and then we will have to note that trade under the preference of the AFCFTA has not yet started, and at the end, Trudy will talk to us about the guided trade initiative, which is an interim arrangement. Trudy, is there anything you want to add?
Not at this point. We can discuss a bit later. Thank you, Professor Asman.
Now, what is the AFCFTA from a technical point of view, and where do we stand? The AFCFTA is, as the term indicates, a continent-wide free trade area agreement. It is not a customs union. And that difference is important. It means that the state parties are responsible for implementing their own obligations under this agreement, but they retain freedom in the respect of their relationships with third parties. They can still conclude third-party trade agreements. And the second point is that this arrangement is anchored in a comprehensive international agreement. It has a legal basis. It is a flagship of the African Union. The decision to have an AFCFTA was taken in 2012. And it's important to note that the idea behind it is that all the 54 or 55 member states of the African Union will be, at the same time, once everything is up and running, also be state parties to the AFCFTA. So the same countries are involved. So all the countries of the African continent are organizing themselves here in a trade arrangement across the board, across the whole continent, to liberalize trade and services, and to do some additional things. It's a comprehensive, very comprehensive arrangement. And it has very serious implementation implications for making all of this come true and to work effectively. The biggest concern is probably trade facilitation, non-tariff barriers, and related matters such as what happened at border posts and the movement. And yesterday morning, the speaker alerted us to that as well. Trudy has already mentioned that there are other initiatives going on. The tripartite free trade area, whose agreement entered into force last year, was launched earlier than the AFCFTA in 2008 already. And it's again another overlapping membership arrangement. We will not focus on the tripartite in this session. We just note that there is a rich garden of flowers on the African continent of various trade arrangements. And it's important to note that the AFCFTA does not abolish them. They continue. The negotiations for the AFCFTA text was launched in 2015. We also said that yesterday. And then in March 2018, the text of the founding agreement and the first three protocols, the protocol on trade and goods, trade and services, and dispute settlement, they were then released with a decision by the summit that they must be signed and ratified so that that package can enter into force, and it did enter into force. And this is a typo, on the 30th of May 2019. But in the meantime, the negotiations continue because we haven't got tariff schedules and we haven't got rules of origin. So trade in goods under the preference of the AFCFTA is not yet possible, and neither is it possible for trade in services. In March 2018, another important document was adopted, the Protocol on Free Movement and Residence was adopted. It was also an African Union initiative, but this document, this protocol, is not part of the AFCFTA package. The AFCFTA package does not contain a protocol on the free movement of persons. There will be, in the context of trade and services, some implications for the movement of service providers. But this document, the protocol on the free movement of persons and freedom of residence, that is something that is linked to the Abuja Treaty. And the last time when I looked, there were only 4 ratifications. So this will take a very long time to enter into force. Next slide, please. All African Union members are to become state parties to the AFCFTA. We stand at 49 ratifications. If I'm correct, Trudy, is that still the figure?
It's actually 48.
48. 48 out of 54 countries have ratified. It means there are another 6 that must still ratify, but that is not a problem. Ratification is not a problem. The problem is to complete the negotiations and then to launch this continent-wide arrangement. Private parties and firms have no standing under the AFCFTA, and they've got no standing under the Dispute Settlement Protocol. If we want to look at the implications of membership, we must ask ourselves, what are the obligations of the state parties and where do we find them? Firms that want to conclude commercial contracts with clients in other African countries will pose this question repeatedly. Where can they go to in our individual countries, and these 48 that are already state parties, to find out what are the procedures, what are the potentials, what are the legal obligations, and all the implications of membership of the AFCFTA. Where do they find that? We sometimes ask this question in oral exams, and it's amazing how many of the participants then tell us we find it on the internet. I think we'll have to do a little bit better than that and make sure that these obligations are in fact translated into legal instruments with domestic effect. Otherwise, our tariff books will not change. Our procedures, the certificates that are required will not be in place. So I want to repeat the point made yesterday that this trade agreement, as other trade agreements also do, it's not self-executing. It needs to be followed up by action in the member states in terms of reforms and amendments to tariff books, to laws, to regulations. And in particular, when it comes to trade and services, there will have to be many regulatory reforms, because services are regulatory intensive. And some of these services are directly linked to trade and goods, logistical services, transport services, access to finance, information, and communication are examples. We said yesterday that although private parties are not entitled to rights under this agreement, there is an annex under the Protocol on Trade and Goods dealing with trade remedies. The difficulty again is that there are only 3 countries on the continent that have domestic legal machinery which is actively implemented. Many countries have them in a somewhat dormant format. But unless we have domestic machinery that will provide for anti-dumping, countervailing, and safeguards, this particular annex cannot be implemented. I make the point about the domestic follow-up action that is required. And then let's also note that the AFCFTA does not create supranational institutions such as the Commission of the EU. The AFCFTA is member-driven, as we will see shortly. We cannot go to Accra and knock on a door and say, and open a door, and there sits the AFCFTA, and then ask it to do certain things. The AFCFTA is implemented through its state parties. Some institutions have been created. The most important two are the Council of Ministers, where decisions in any case are taken by consensus. So everyone will have to be involved. And then the Committee of Senior Trade Officials. We will come to that. Why does it take so long for this to be completed? It is not because our governments are mala fide. It's because it's difficult and complicated. And yesterday, Tri discussed with us the implications for loss of tariff revenue. I mentioned the fact that follow-up actions are required. And we must understand that governments must look at their defensive and offensive interests. What happens to domestic industries? In the beginning, when in March 2018, this document, the AFCFTA document agreement was discussed and adopted in Kigali, the proceedings started on a Monday morning, and on that Sunday evening, it was announced that the president of Nigeria has cancelled his visit. And for many months after that, Nigeria didn't actively participate. Now, why did he cancel his visit? Because he had, over that weekend, according to the Nigerian press, received a visit from the local industries in Nigeria, complaining about the fact that they read in the newspapers that he is going to sign away the protection that they enjoy at the borders in Nigeria the next morning, and they were not informed. So what does it tell us? It tells us several things, and one of them is that there must be a balance with domestic interest, and that is one of the reasons why these negotiations take so long. And those countries that are industrialized, more industrialized, will have more sophisticated and more complicated needs, more complex issues to consider. What happens when the AFCFTA is up and running? Well, the regs that already provide for free trade in goods on the continent They continue. So we must expect that whatever will happen as a consequence of the business sectors on the continent looking at the AFCFTA and seeing in it a potential for business and commerce and making money that did not exist before. Will they prefer some domestic African markets in lieu of markets that they have on the a global level? I don't know, but many other things in terms of successful commercialization of the potential will be required. Infrastructure, transport, domestic follow-up, and so on. Later on, we will listen to Trudy when she tells us about the guided trade initiative, and that is what we can take as a yardstick for the lessons. Are we learning some lessons about the challenges that will have to be overcome when we want to implement continent-wide free trade in goods and services? Next one. Here is the list of ratifications. Trudy says there are 48 countries that have already ratified. Here you can find the list. I think this picture is important because it tells us who are the outstanding countries in West Africa and in Southern Africa have all already ratified. Next one. Now here is the architecture of the AFCFTA. Let's pause and look at it for a minute. How does this arrangement look? Now at the top we have what we sometimes call the founding agreement. In the text it is called the Agreement Establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. If we look at that document, that is what appears on the front page. It literally says it's the agreement for establishing the African Continental Free Trade Area. Then it has, underneath that, two categories of, or three categories as depicted here, of protocols. Now, the light green ones are the phase one protocols, and they were negotiated and concluded first and were affected by the decision of March 2018 to sign and to ratify. So the light green part here forms part of the AFCFTA, let's call it the first phase building blocks. We've got a protocol on trade in goods, on services, and dispute settlement. But there's very important information down here. The detail in respect of the various obligations of the state parties, we find in the documents down here. The deeper we delve, the more detailed and clear the picture becomes. So these 9 annexes, which cover the schedules of tariff concessions, still outstanding, the rules of origin, still outstanding, and then all these other ones, customs cooperation, trade facilitation, NTBs, TBTs, SPS, transit, and trade remedies. That collection is the substance of the rules and institutions about liberalizing trade in goods under the AFCFTA. We've got the same for services. The protocol on trade and services is far less developed, but there's more work to be done here. And Trudy can tell us what is outstanding. For protocol on rules and procedures for dispute settlement, that is complete. That is that has been finalized. There's not recently been any additional action here. And then we have here in light blue, the protocol on competition, on intellectual property rights and investment. They are mentioned in the text of this document as the phase 2 protocols. They are, for all practical purposes, also completed in as far as the negotiations are concerned. Most of the outstanding work are in respect of digital trade and women and the youth in trade, because these two have been added as new protocols subsequently. They are not mentioned in the text, but it is fully acceptable. Provision is made for new protocols to be added to this list that we see here on this slide. Trudy, is there anything of importance that we have to know about how far the work has progressed for the protocols in the light blue and the dark blue?
Yes. Honourable members, our SG referred to the AU summit, so the meeting of heads of state and government in Addis Ababa very recently. And in fact, the annexes to the Protocol on Digital Trade have been adopted by the Assembly. So there are 8 annexes, and they cover issues related to digital trade, cybersecurity, digital signatures, protection of consumers and users of digital platforms, and so on. So a lot of very important governance issues, digital trade governance issues that are covered in those 8 annexes. We are waiting for those texts to become available, and we will certainly share them with you. On the Protocol on Women and Youth, it makes provision for annexes, but no annexes have been developed yet. I think just perhaps, Professor Erasmus, if we could say something about the entry into force of these protocols. But before I hand back to you, the Protocol on Intellectual Property Rights, the annexes which will cover different property rights instruments, marks covering trademarks and service marks, utility models, geographical indications, traditional knowledge, source code, and many, many other intellectual property rights instruments are not complete yet. The Protocol on Investment will have a dedicated annex on dispute settlement that is not finalized yet. So that's the latest update we have. Back to you, Professor Erasmus.
Truly, this is why it is so constructive to work with you. You can always correct me and add in and fill up the gaps in my own knowledge. Thank you for helping today. You said we must say something about the entry into force of these protocols. I did mention yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, SG, that there is a provision, and as a matter of fact, we have put this Article 23 of the AFCFTA founding agreement, we put it in, and it's part of your slide. But there we find a dedicated provision in this agreement telling us how the AFCFTA agreement and the protocols will enter into force. Now, the basic information is that this agreement, the agreement establishing the AFCFTA, plus the green 3 protocols, the first phase protocols, shall enter into force 30 days after the deposit of the 22nd instrument of ratification. And that has happened. So that part, the light green, has been covered by the entry into force, which happened at the end of May 2019. But then the next paragraph of Article 23 says, the protocols on investment, intellectual property rights, competition, and any other instruments, that is now where women and the youth and digital trade come in, they shall enter into force 30 days after the deposit of the 22nd instrument of ratification. So on the basis of Article 23, it means that the protocols in the light blue and in the dark blue must still be ratified. What does that ratification imply? It means that the executive branch of government, the Ministry of Trade, I assume in the state parties, must prepare instruments of ratification, which they must deposit with the chair of the African Union Commission. In some countries, such as South Africa, ratification gives also a role to parliaments, not by allowing parliaments to be part of the ratification process. That's an executive function. But parliaments may have to approve, as is the case in South Africa, the text of what the executive has negotiated. So that's the answer to that one. You can find it in Article 23 of the AFCFTA agreement. Next slide, please. The governing principles of the AFCFTA, we haven't really listed many provisions of this founding agreement for your information directly in the slides, but we did select a few. And this Article 5 is one of them. I want to read through it very quickly because this explains to us the philosophy behind the AFCFTA, the future of the AFCFTA, what we can expect once it's implemented, and how it will live together with arrangements such as SADC. Look at those various principles there, and this is a direct a replication of Article 5. The AFCFTA shall be governed emphatically by the following principles, driven by the member states of the African Union. It means the member states are in charge. There's no supranational organization or structure above them. Second, the REC free trade areas are the building blocks for the AFCFTA. But it's not the RECs that are the building blocks. It's only the RECs free trade areas. Remember those four that Trudy identified, namely SADC, ECOWAS, EAC, and COMESA. They are building blocks for the AFCFTA. Now, why is this so? It's so because they have trade regimes. They have already liberalized trade amongst their own member states. And as we go down, we will see that there are other provisions here that support and enhance this implication. Variable geometry has been mentioned, and flexible and special differential treatment. Now, remember that this was adopted before the negotiations started. As a matter of fact, the same principles appear in the text of the TFTA, the Tripartite Free Trade Area. We haven't seen dramatic accommodation of variable geometry and flexible and special differential treatment. All state parties to the AFCFTA must eventually implement exactly the same obligations. The LDCs have a little bit longer to liberalize, to remove, to take away the tariffs on goods, but eventually, after 13 years, all must be duty-free for the 90% of the tariff lines and the 7% of the sensitive goods. Transparency and disclosure of information, vital. How it will happen, this agreement doesn't tell us. It will depend on what we subsequently do. And here is a very important one. The AFCFTA shall be governed by the preservation of the acquis. What does that mean? Since round about 2011, the vocabulary that we have in Africa on regional integration has been expanded to include this concept. It was officially adopted as a guiding principle of the Tripartite Free Trade Area and then repeated in this Article 5 of the AFCFTA. And it's a French term, a legal term, that means what already exists shall be preserved. Now, that what already exists is the trade liberalization that we have achieved already in previous decades of time through the RECs. So the RECs are not abolished. We will show you some other provisions confirming this. Then it tells us there will be an MFN, a national treatment, but there is a specific understanding of MFN. We find it in Article 18 of the main agreement. Reciprocity, nothing is for free. You will have to make concessions in order to enjoy the benefits here. Substantial liberalization, eventually 97% of tariff lines will be liberalized. So that will be met consensus in decision making. That is what we traditionally do in the continent. And it also says the best practice in the RECs, in the state parties and international conventions binding on the African Union shall be respected. Are there any questions, or Trudy, do you want to say anything about this, or can we continue? There are some other provisions like Article 19 that I have to mention quickly.
I think we can continue. Thanks, Professor.
Let's do so. Thank you. Now, I have quoted here two important provisions, and what appears here, we have taken from Article 19, paragraph 2 of the founding agreement and Article 8.2 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods. They have introductory paragraphs, but here is the essence. Let's see what they say. State parties that are members of other regional economic communities, RECs, or regional trading arrangements and customs unions which have attained among themselves higher levels of regional integration than under this agreement, shall maintain such higher levels among themselves. Now, this is an important implication. It means the philosophy says we are not going to sacrifice and tear up the legal instruments that already have brought many benefits in terms of trade liberalization and integration. They continue. They continue next to and in conjunction with all the others that we have on the continent and next to the AFCFTA. Now, how will this have implications and what implications might this have for the private sector? Not very serious implications. If an exporter in country A, let's take real examples in SADC. If there's a firm in Zambia that produces or grows certain products, and it wants to export them, it has a buyer next door in Zimbabwe. Which agreement, which trade agreement, which protocol will govern and make sure that transaction and make sure that the goods go from Zambia to Zimbabwe in a duty-free procedure? Is there an agreement that makes that possible? Well, at the moment, there are two. Both are members of COMESA and of SADC. Does this fact pose a serious problem in customs administration? And we visited some of these border posts where this is the position. It's not really a problem as long as the customs officials have the tariff books updated. So if an exporter arrives at the border post and submits documentation in terms of the SADC trade protocol and complies with all the requirements, there shouldn't be a problem. If it submits documentation in terms of the COMESA trade protocol, then the legal basis for processing that transaction must be in the tariff book, and there will be no problem. Article 8.2, of the Protocol on Trade in Goods deals with the same idea, but is slightly differently formulated, and therefore I have to share it with you as well. State parties that are members of other RECs, which have attained among themselves higher levels of elimination of customs duties and trade barriers compared to those provided for in this product, shall maintain and, where possible, improve upon those higher levels. So the second quote here is an invitation, is a mandate for an organization such as TRAC under the Trade Protocol of SADC to deepen and to make its intra-SADC trade even more free and more effective. And when it does so, it will boost trade in SADC and it will boost trade across the continent and with the rest of the world. If we can get the game changer right about trade facilitation and transport and customs clearance on the continent, then all our trade relations will benefit from that. Next one. This is the last quote that I have directly from the text of the relevant AFCFTA documents. And this is Article 4 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods. Let's read it through it quickly. And by the way, we at TRELAC emphasize that we always go to the original sources. We don't read newspapers when we want to understand what trade agreements mean. Now let's read together through this and unpack it. Nothing in this protocol shall prevent a state party from concluding or maintaining preferential trade arrangements with third parties. Now, who are third parties? Third parties are countries that are not parties to the AFCFTA. In other words, now we're talking about China and the EU and the UK and the US and so on. These are global parties. Nothing in this protocol, the AFCFTA Protocol on Trade in Goods, shall prevent a state party to the AFCFTA from concluding or maintaining preferential trade arrangements with third parties. provided that such trade arrangements do not impede or frustrate on the objective of this protocol, and that any advantage, concession, or privilege granted to a third party is extended to other state parties. Oops! However, on a reciprocal basis, they will not be automatic. You will have to negotiate them and, through reciprocity, pay for them. So what are we going to discover? What are we discovering here? We are discovering a deliberate design choice made by the founding parties, by the state parties, to boost intra-African trade on the continent by extending preferential trade in goods and services so that all 55 countries will be covered, and so that all importers, exporters, and traders in those 55 countries will consider the possibility of extending their commercial relations to markets further afield and find clients there with whom they will enter into commercial transactions to export their goods to other African destinations as well. Trudy said something this morning which is very important. The neighborhood trade arrangements, for example, in the SADC region, that is well known, that is close by, and is well trodden. And by that I mean the procedures have already been established. It is 7,000 kilometers from Cape Town to Nigeria. How will goods arrive in Nigeria? If they will be transported by road, as is the predominant means of intra-African transport, you can think for yourself that a logistical company or an importer exporter will face some very severe challenges. Now, for services, it might be, in principle, very different. However, and Trudy can tell us more about it, up till now, the experiences with respect to trade and services among some African countries, especially in the cell phone sector, has been quite challenging. So services can be different in terms of the dealing with the problems of what happens at borders, but services trade faces other challenges, and that is that the regulations and the arrangements and the policies in the various member states differ. So they will have to be harmonized. The NTBs of trade and services are unharmonized regulations. Paragraph 2 says, nothing in this protocol shall prevent two or more state parties from extending to one another preferences which aim at achieving the objectives of this protocol among themselves, provided that such preferences are extended to the other state parties on a reciprocal basis. And this is very interesting. It opens the door for bilateral arrangements. Then thirdly, notwithstanding the provisions of these other two paragraphs, a state party shall not be obliged to extend to another state party trade preferences extended to other state parties or third parties before the entry into force of this agreement. Let's stop there for a moment. We know that South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Mozambique are since 2016 in an EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement, with the European Union. And it works quite well. It's a very important export destination for us, as the data shared by Trudy this morning confirms. And what do we find here? We find here a policy choice that says the AFCFTA is pro-global trade. This is the hard reality. This is the hard reality. We want to boost African intertrade to the extent that it will be possible through the opportunities that we provide for the private sector. There are no prohibitions on continuing to deepen intra-African trade or to establish trade agreements with third parties and to improve them. And what we have here is actually saying there's no obligation on South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, and so on, to extend to other AFCFTA state parties the tariff concessions that they have granted to the EU when they traded there. It would be a very nice thing if they could do so, but we must remember, I want to chip in here, the negotiations for a particular trade agreement are complicated, are difficult, and are sui generis, are specific, are unique. It took many, many years for concluding the EPA text, and it is still taking time to conclude the AFCFTA legal instruments. This extension of better preferences will not happen automatically. It will have to be negotiated. The state party shall afford opportunity to other state parties to negotiate the preferences granted therein, that is, in agreements with third parties, on a reciprocal basis, taking into account levels of development of state parties. Now, we haven't yet seen any initiatives here. It's too early. Initiatives will only happen once the AFCFTA is up and running. But it's important that we understand what thinking inspired the governments of our governments, our 55 governments, well, 54 because Eritrea didn't participate. How do they see the AFCFTA as a package, a compact of liberalizing trade for all of them, while very definitely recognizing existing key advantages in the country and third-party relationships. The AFCFTA is not anti-global trade. It cannot be. Trudy, you want to say something?
Thanks, Professor Erasmus. Very briefly, I think absolutely true. It's a very realistic legal compact, recognizing what exists on the continent already. It doesn't say we do away with regional economic community trading arrangements, not at all. And in the same vein, it recognizes the importance of global trade relationships. And in fact, the interconnectedness of the African producers, traders, not only in trade as far as the global relations are concerned, but also in the value chains. So it recognizes the importance of trade industrial linkages across the continent, but also with global partners. So I think it's a very realistic compact that we have.
We might just add that given the recent developments and what has been coming from Washington since last month, that the global trade picture will be seriously affected. And what we see in the previous slide, that Article 4 of the Protocol on Trade in Goods might become even more important as a result of consequences and developments which subsequently became part of the global picture. Here are the institutions of the AFCFTA. The Assembly of the African Union, which of course consists of the very same countries that are members of the AFCFTA, has an oversight role. Article 11, 12, and 13 are very important because they tell us that the Council of Ministers is ultimately responsible for steering the AFCFTA and making sure that it is implemented. Who is this council? It's the senior trade ministers, or other ministers, may also be Minister of Finance, that will meet from time to time, at least twice a year, to discuss AFCFTA related matters. Those matters will come on the agenda of this council through the Committee of Senior Trade Officials. Who are they? They are the PSs and Directors General of Trade and maybe Finance and so on of the state parties.
Professor Erasmus, if I may just interrupt you there, keep in mind also, honourable members, that the regional economic communities are represented in the Committee of Senior Trade Officials in an advisory capacity. So this is where we see an institutional link between the REC institutions and the institutions of the AFCFTA. Apologies for interjecting there.
No. This is very useful. This is why we have you on board. Thank you, Trudy. The dispute settlement body is established in terms of the protocol on dispute settlement, and it provides for panels and the appellate body. We have replicated the WTO dispute settlement formula. And then there is in Article 13 of the main agreement provision for the AFCFTA Secretariat, which is in Accra, and which is the only permanent institution of the AFCFTA. It is staffed by officials permanently working there, and it has to do what the Council of Ministers tells it to do, and it must support and give technical assistance to the state parties. It also has, and that brings us to the next slide. It is also important to note this, the information on this slide. Each and every one of the protocols, each and every one of the annexes, of the protocols and the annexes, provides for additional bodies, committees. There's a committee on trade in goods, on trade in services, on investment, competition, intellectual property rights, digital trade, women, and the youth in trade. Now, who will be meeting here? These are platforms for meetings attended by officials from the various state parties to discuss matters that pertain to their obligations, let's say under the Protocol on Trade in Goods. Now let's look further. The Protocol on Trade in Goods has this committee, and then there are subcommittees. There are subcommittees for the annexes on rules of origin, trade remedies, TBTs, NTBs, and then there's the one on SPS, and this, which I think this one will be very important, a subcommittee on trade facilitation, customs cooperation, and transit. They have put together 3 annexes here. This, I think, will be a very important institution of the AFCFTA. So it's a bottom-up design. There are not yet all the rules of procedure available, but we are trying to collect all the rules of procedure for these committees so that we can know when will they convene and who will take the initiative to call for a meeting. Do you want to add something?
No, I think the last point is particularly important.
Then the next slide. Turi, this is to you. We have now covered our allocated time. But can you quickly take us through the update on the negotiations for trade in goods?
Thanks very much, Professor Rasmus and SG. With your indulgence, I will move through this quite quickly, but this is the latest update on the negotiations and also on the guided trade initiative. 49 provisional schedules of tariff concessions have been submitted to the AFCFTA Secretariat, and 46 of those have been technically verified. So, honorable members, what happens with the tariff offers is each country, and let's say Zambia or Malawi, or the members of a customs union such as SACU, will make an offer to reduce duties that meets the requirements of the modalities for the negotiations. And these I will deal with very briefly in the next slide. So this very big Excel spreadsheet of tariff reductions proposed by Malawi or Zambia or SACU would be submitted to the AFCFTA Secretariat. They will check whether it complies with the agreed modalities. In other words, what percentage of tariff lines will have to be liberalized, over what time frame, and so on. Which tariff lines will be excluded. Now, honorable members, we often refer to tariff lines, And the reason is that every product we trade has a tariff code. These tariff codes are agreed internationally in the World Customs Organization. Together with the customs code, there's also a product description. And this is so important that we all agree on the tariff codes and product descriptions, because this assists our customs officers at border posts to take a look at whether the product has been correctly classified. And the correct classification is important so that the appropriate duty, or if the product is going to be duty-free, that it can be allocated that treatment. So these are very important issues. The most recent Council of Ministers meeting took place at the end of November last year. And the members, these are the members, the Council of Ministers, the Ministers of Trade, have urged the member states that have not yet submitted their tariff offers and schedules of commitments for trade and services to do so promptly. So in other words, finalize the negotiations, finalize these offers of concessions on duties, but also on commitments for trade and services. At that most recent meeting, 2 SADC member states, Mozambique and Zimbabwe, had their tariff offers accepted as technically verified by the AFCFTA Secretariat. So that's an important achievement. As Professor Erasmus has indicated, the negotiations are taking quite a long time. And it's not surprising, because the tariff negotiations give expression to the offensive interests, but also the defensive interests of a country. Which industries are to be protected, and hence their duties will not be liberalized. They may be excluded from liberalization. That's an extremely important trade policy, but also industrial policy decision. And all of our countries, honorable members, want to industrialize. So we all want to protect certain industries, but at the same time, we would all like access to export markets. So you can see that tensions are likely to arise, and it's sometimes difficult to reach those necessary concessions which will move the negotiations ahead. Rules of origin, we've spoken about this before. The rules of origin determine the national origin of a product, and they are the passport to duty-free or reduced duty market access. In other words, they are there to ensure that only products that should be eligible for trade under the AFCFTA will indeed enjoy the preferences we have negotiated. But these are technical requirements. And again, the rules of origin may be used to protect the domestic industry. So if rules of origin are complex, then it's difficult to meet them. And we see that, for example, under SADC and COMESA, where some trade doesn't take place under the preferences of SADC or COMESA, but under the duties of the World Trade Organization, so trade without preferences. Indeed, on the continent as a whole, when we take a look at all the trading arrangements that exist, only 35% of all the trade on the continent actually gets the benefit of the preferences. And one of the reasons that this figure is so low is because rules of origin are quite stringent. So the rules of origin negotiations are closely linked to the tariff negotiations. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. But the Council of Ministers has approved October 2025 as the deadline for completing the rules of origin negotiations. What is outstanding, honourable members, is rules of origin for some clothing and textile tariff lines and some automotive and motor vehicle products and components. Now, these two industries, sectors, are of interest to many countries in SADC, but also across the continent. And this makes it very difficult to find the necessary compromise. So these negotiations are ongoing, and we will keep you updated. At the bottom of the slide, honourable members, we have reference to special economic zones. Now, special economic zones are part of our industrial development and our industrial policy initiatives. They are designated areas where governments usually provide certain infrastructure and also subsidized utilities, water, energy. They might provide, for example, energy security within a special economic zone. They may also provide other incentives, such as tax preferences. And the reason for special economic zones is to attract foreign direct investment. And so the firms that locate within a special economic zone enjoy preferences. They are subsidized, while firms that are located outside special economic zones do not enjoy those privileges and preferences. So an important discussion in the AFCFTA was, how do we treat products that have enjoyed these privileges and preferences and subsidies under the AFCFTA? And after much discussion, there was agreement that products produced in a special economic zone can enjoy AFCFTA preferences provided they meet the rules of origin. So this would include ensuring the integrity of the AFCFTA, but allowing the use of special economic zone industrial policy initiatives. So transshipment would be prevented in this case. A case, for example, where T-shirts might be imported from, let's say, Turkey. They come to a factory in a special economic zone and some buttons or some accessories are sewn onto the garment, and they are then exported to other African countries. That value addition, sewing on a button or an accessory, would not qualify under the rules of origin requirements. And so this would not enjoy preferences under the AFCFTA. So the rules of origin are designed to prevent transshipment. In other words, sneaking into the AFCFTA while not meeting the rules of origin requirements. I think this is just very briefly on the tariff phase down. The tariff phase down is counted from the 1st of January 2021. And this is as a result of Council of Ministers' decision. They issued a regulation, which means that the provisional schedules of tariff concessions, those provisional offers that have been made, can be implemented for cross-border trade under the Guided Trade Initiative. So this ministerial regulation provides a legal basis for the guided trade initiative, while we recognize that the full AFCFTA is still under negotiation. And so the guided trade initiative covers products in category A, so those that are liberalized first, 90% of tariff lines. And the guided trade initiative, which started with 7 participating countries, no one in SADC is participating as an initial participant. But subsequently, some SADC countries have joined. The launch of the GTI in October 2022 is extremely important, but we have to keep in mind that the tariff negotiations on sensitive products and the excluded products are still continuing. This, and we're almost at the end, SG, sorry we're taking so much time, is a letter from South African Revenue Service. And it explains how the AFCFTA will work. And very importantly, on the second page, it states categorically that South African traders trading with other companies in SADC will continue to trade under the SADC Trade Protocol. So that's a very clear statement. It also states that South African traders, importers, or exporters may trade with 7 other African countries under this provisional arrangement, the Guided Trade Initiative: Algeria, Cameroon, Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and Tunisia. So, as you see, honorable members, the AFCFTA is still work in progress. We are still negotiating the terms and conditions, but a pilot initiative, the Guided Trade Initiative, has begun. Now, here are some of the shipments from South Africa. First consignment went at the end of January 2024, and they went to Ghana and to Kenya, and included, most importantly, were fridges produced by Hisense, company that produces consumer and electrical products. It is a Chinese company that has established commercial presence in South Africa. It's invested in South Africa, produces fridges, and because it has commercial presence in South Africa, it can trade under the AFCFTA. This is legitimate trade. The first consignment of goods under the GTI had gone from Kenya to Ghana. And if you look at the photographs, honorable members, you'll see it was tea from the company Ketepa. It's a cooperative, a very successful cooperative that includes small growers of tea, and they aggregate production, process, ferment the tea as is necessary, and they export very successfully. So this was the first consignment under the Guided Trade Initiative. To conclude, the requirements to participate in the Guided Trade Initiative are quite important. Clearly, the country must be a state party. They must have signed and ratified the AFCFTA agreement. They must have submitted a tariff offer, so have a schedule of tariff concessions, which has been verified by the AFCFTA Secretariat and approved by the Council of Ministers. And so it falls under the permissible trade as designated in the Ministerial Directive number 1 of 2021. They must have, and let's go back to this slide very quickly, they must have gazetted the change to the tariff book. So this is South Africa's tariff book, which is also, because we're in a customs union, the tariff book of SACU countries, and you will see on the right-hand side, there is a column for the AFCFTA. So that's very important to keep in mind. They must have an ad hoc or standing committee for AFCFTA coordination, so different ministries, agriculture, trade, and other ministries and agencies participating in that committee. They must have designated the competent authority that will issue the rules of origin certificates. That's usually the revenue authority. They must have notified the designated customs authority and submitted specimen stamps and authorized signatures, because officials from the revenue authority will sign those rules of origin certificates. And on the importing country side, the customs officer must have a list of all the legitimate stamps and signatures that he or she will recognize when a consignment of goods comes to the border post. They must also have notified non-tariff measures. And honorable members, we discussed those yesterday. Those are the standard sanitary and phytosanitary measures or technical barriers to trade. So if we are exporting agricultural products, then the SPS certificate is extremely important, which means that this consignment of agricultural products has met the standards that assure human, plant, animal health and the environment. They must also, and this is a final requirement, which is really a trade facilitation and promotion requirement, they must mobilize and connect businesses with other members so that this can help to promote trade. So these are very important requirements for participating in the guided trade initiative. We know that other countries are now joining the GTI. We've heard, for example, that Namibia has joined, and other SADC countries are preparing to do the same. But most important is that we commit, as the Council of Ministers has indicated in the meeting in November, to completing the negotiations so that we have trade under the full AFCFTA. Professor Erasmus, any comment from you? And we can stop here.
I've got nothing to add. Thank you so much, Trudy.
SG, apologies for using extra time, but I think we've covered quite a lot of territory on the AFCFTA, and we look forward to hear if members have any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Trudy. I think it was necessary to expatiate as you did. I think it really puts us in a very comfortable place in appreciating the pockets that we need to focus on related to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I particularly also appreciated you looking at the philosophy behind it and the practicalities, and also the key placeholders in terms of ensuring that we actually take this forward. Something is telling me to speak in Portuguese. I don't know what that is. Let me just cancel. Okay, so I really appreciate that completely. I would invite honorable members to make input before I just say my goodbyes to both you and Professor Erasmus and the TRALAC team. So at this point, Masenati, kindly assist me to locate members who are raising their hands so that they can make their input. I see Honorable David Mandla Skosana from South Africa. Are there any hands, honorable members, so that I take at least 3 hands at this point and allow us to make the interventions? Then, we respond.
There's more hands from Madagascar.
Okay, how many? Okay, I see Madagascar. I see Honorable Fisa Hassan from South Africa as well. May we just take those three hands in that order? Honorable David Mandla Skosana, kindly take the floor, and then followed by Madagascar, Honorable Tudimainana. Amari, the last name, I apologize for that. And then the third hand should be Honorable Fisher Hassan from South Africa.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to say that I think we can do better, especially if we can improve the borders. You know, in the recent weeks, as you know, the issue which erupted after the election in Mozambique, it was a nightmare for business people. I mean, for us to trade between countries, as you know, Mozambique is one of the most busiest, you know, border, you know, to almost aligning us and other countries as well. You know, as you know, that we are trading, you know, these countries, we are trading among ourselves. You know, you name Angola, you know, the DRC, Malawi, and yeah. And the problem when there's no enough, you know, a working relationship between countries, which would that affect, you know, the trading in all these SADC countries, in fact, into to the world, you know, necessary SADC. Zimbabwe as well, a big challenge, though it has improved a bit, but I must say that as soon as we, the SADC countries, improve our borders for efficient purpose, it will really help all of us, because the delay, the turnaround, you know, if you go to those borders, you look at the way the trafficking, you know, the goods are transported. As you know, our railway lines are in tatters in Africa, you know, but indeed, the sooner we get together and resolve these issues of borders, you know, the better for us all. Because one incident which erupts in particular in these two areas which I've mentioned, the Mozambican border and the Zimbabwean border, you know, that stifle the economy of all these SADC countries. For me, I think we have to discuss that too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Trudy, you spoke about, yesterday, both of you spoke about this particular impediment. And I think it would be good to revisit and also, you know, shine a little bit of light in terms of the concern that has been raised. May I kindly have Madagascar, Honorable Todimana?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you,
Yes, we
sir.
can
We
hear
can
you.
hear you.
Yes. Thank you for giving the floor. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for organizing such a video conference, because, as you know, we in Madagascar, we are an island, and there's a lot of issues that are mainly related to borders, like our honorable member just said, that are just very difficult to apprehend for us in Madagascar. And that kind of conference is very useful for us to see the urgency to reach final agreements on this particular issue of trade facilitation. And as you could see, Madagascar has not ratified yet the protocol, any protocol, but we have signed many. And I would like to emphasize the fact that we as MPs, we are going to look at that very closely to see what are the obstacles and the impediments that prevent us from moving forward, because this is very important. And this is a kind of following the question that I raised yesterday about AI. We see that nowadays in this new world, there will be a lot of commercial wars between blocks, between geographical blocks. And if we in Africa, indeed in SADC, we are not capable of uniting and be in agreement in our trade practices will be more and more fractured, about what is going on, what is coming in the next few months. But we, as Madagascar MPs, we are going to look at that very closely, and especially, and I think one of the most obstacle for us is the rule of origin issue. As you know, it is very difficult for us as an island to apprehend and to verify the rules of origin rule as regard to the many products that enter into Africa and go afterwards to Madagascar. And I think that's the main reason and the main obstacle that made it impossible to ratify the protocols that have been signed so far. Thank you for listening. And I would like again to congratulate and extend my appreciation to the distinguished professors and lecturers for this conference that gave us a lot of information. As for myself, I am a newly elected MP, and it's very enlightened. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Honorable Tudimanana Ami Haisinte Bofeno. I'll get better at that. Thank you very much. Yes.
It's Yassin Befin Tudimanana.
Okay, thank you. I'll have to see you after this. Okay. But thank you so much. I think very critical comments that you're making, the commitment you're putting forward, very much appreciated. Let's move on to the next, the last, is it the last or the honorable member from South Africa? Honorable Fasiha Hassan.
I'm going to keep it on to introduce myself because I'm also in a transiting area. But effectively, I just wanted to make 2 or 3 points. The first was, of course, to the presentation that's been for us also. It's my first term, and finding it incredibly fascinating in terms of some different trade relations, and also just a revival of, having studied economics in the past. But the point I really wanted to make is at the same time, we've also been running parallel meetings with you. And what's come very clearly is that a fair amount of our trade and we are often our own worst enemies in that we are struggling with network.
Yes, that's honorable.
Can I just confirm, am I audible?
You are cracking up. You're cracking up, but we're trying to listen hard.
So I'm moving to a better location. I'm just trying to move to a better spot. But effectively, yes, we've had a few meetings this week with the EU, and the point I wanted to make is that a fair amount of our trade actually does happen in the SADC region, but also more continentally throughout Africa. And we are not as specific in terms of creating favorable agreements on both sides. And often we see each other more as, I wouldn't say hostile, but I would say we don't see each other in a Pan-African kind of manner, and we're really looking only at the bottom line of the trade. And I think there's so much more that can be garnered through a number of different opportunities that have already been spoken about in the last session in the training, but also about how we create ourselves as globally competitive trade markets, because we have the critical minerals, we have the ability, and we're slowly starting to build further capacity for beneficiation. And that needs to be one of the big things that I think we need to focus on in the SADC region. But it was really just to make those comments and observations and to say thank you, because I'm also not sure if my network is also breaking up. But thank you so much. And also maybe to lastly say, fascinating discussion. It would be wonderful to keep them going, especially keeping them very thematic. So, even if we unpack each trade agreement and what we need to do and what we can do, I think, or personally, that would be very, very useful, because then it informs our domestic policy formulation as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Fasia, for that optimism. This is precisely the themes that have been cutting across, the renaissance that is required, among others. I didn't see any other hand. I see the questions are linked. That's why I was trying to sneak in the last hand. Trudy, if you allow me, so that we could just take all of them together. I don't see any hand. At this point, I'll hand over to yourself and Professor Erasmus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, SG, and honourable members. Thank you very much for those questions and contributions. I'll ask Professor Erasmus to say something about Honourable David Scorsano's question. My brief comment here is of course that if we take a look at trade, conflict, peace and security issues, the reality check is that conflict and unrest are not good for trade, not good for regional integration. I think we do recognize that South Africa and Mozambique have been very much connected in this trade facilitation value chain, while South Africa has been experiencing challenges in its transport, but also its port harbour infrastructure. Much domestic trade from certain industries, such as timber, but also agricultural products, have been exported not only to other African markets, but also to global destinations via Mozambique. And so we've seen that governance failures lead to the development of new transport corridors, if you like, as businesses really try desperately to get their products to market. And this may well mean that we start to see new trade routes developing. But as we've seen
for Southern Africa, many of the landlocked countries in our region, and they include Botswana, they include Zambia, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has a link to the northern part of Beira port in Mozambique. But just as the difficulties in Maputo and in Mozambique must be mentioned, the difficulties in South Africa must be recognized. Some of our ports face serious difficulties. We still have a lot of issues about appointing logistical services companies, revitalizing, refurbishing. Many of the agricultural exports in South Africa have been suffering as a result of difficulties not in Mozambique, but in South African ports. So the overall picture, and then of course there is a Sishen-Saldanha railway line and port that faces also its own problems. The bigger picture here is that we are interconnected. We are a region. Corridors are very, very important. And as our Honourable MP has indicated, there are problems, and there are problems in several of the countries in SADC. So we must emphasize the importance of that observation. Now, what are we going to do about it? There is a protocol in SADC on transport as well. Maybe we should look at some of these other protocols as well and activate the mechanisms, the institutions, and the bodies. Thirdly, I don't know what the prospects are for long-term peace and stability in Mozambique. I know that in terms of the latest reports that I've seen, that matters have calmed down, but there are research institutions that claim that there are still long-term issues and systemic issues that must be addressed and must be investigated. And the government of Mozambique needs to be supported in that regard. So I fully agree with the validity of pointing out how interdependent we are, and that there are many challenges when it comes to corridors, to harbors, to transport routes, and to railway lines. And it is completely true what the implication is, and that is that this is very urgent work that has to be done collectively and jointly in order not only to serve the markets and the producers in particular sectors, but the whole region, and in any case to unlock the potential of the AFCFTA. Trade facilitation is probably our biggest challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Erasmus. Just one point to add there about border management issues. honorable members, a border has two sides. So we export from one country and import on the other side of the border. And Trellick has had the privilege of working at some one-stop border posts in the SADC region. And at one of the border posts, we spoke to customs officers on the one side, and we said, how are things working in terms of the one-stop border post? And he said, well, we only let 3 or 4 trucks through at a time on our side. Otherwise, they get stuck on the other side of the border. And honorable members, if you listen carefully to that, he was saying to us that it wasn't actually working like a one-stop border post, because a one-stop border post would mean that once clearance procedures have been finalized on the one side, the one-stop border post means that the consignments simply proceed. So it reminds us again of this interdependence of we have to collaborate, we have to work together to make our borders work more efficiently, our transport, logistics, corridors, our ports. We all have an interest in improving the quality of infrastructure, but also the governance of infrastructure and infrastructure facilities. Our second contribution came from Honorable Tori Manana, if I may use that. And first of all, I have to say, I've never been to Madagascar, so I'm really looking forward to coming at some stage. And I recently saw a very important project. Being an island, there are, of course, opportunities that you have that may not be available to landlocked countries, but you also face, as a small island economy, specific challenges. But growing caviar, there seems to be a very successful project. It's not happened overnight. It's apparently about 15 years in the making. And I wish you all the best with that. I think that's very, very exciting. We need success stories like this for small trading nations. I think the issues you mentioned about ratification and your assessment that it's most probably as a result of rules of origin, I can well understand that. The rules of origin are extremely important, but we can also use them in a very counterproductive manner. And this actually links to a comment made by Honorable Fasia, and that is that when we take a look at trade agreements that we conclude amongst ourselves, specifically when we focus on rules of origin, they are sometimes much more stringent in the agreements amongst ourselves than rules of origin in agreements with our global partners. And we find that difficult to understand. But on the other hand, this is about protecting industries that countries have. So I think we need to change the way we think about the trade agreements amongst ourselves and take a look at how we can look at the potential, the future benefits, not just protect what we have. Because if we're only protecting what we have, we will not be changing our production structures. We will not be opening to foreign direct investment to come and diversify and develop our production structures. It takes bold leadership to do that. It takes complementary domestic policies focusing on skills development, improving investment governance, making doing business easier, reducing red tape, and many, many things which are not easy to do, but they're absolutely necessary if we are going to transform our economies and have trade as a facilitating instrument, not bringing additional impediments, so that the uptake of preferences can improve from the current 35% on average that we have across the continent. It's a very poor statistic. It means our preferential trade agreements are not working effectively to promote trade amongst ourselves. And I think this is a reality check that we need to consider quite carefully. The AFCFTA is still under construction in certain respects. What needs to be done? And so as Madagascar considers its ratification, I think it's an opportunity to discuss some of these issues. Professor Erasmus, would you like to add any comments to that and also respond to Honorable Fasia's contribution?
No, thank you, Trudy. I've got nothing more to add. I want my coffee now.
Thank you very much. Well-deserved coffee, Professor. And thank you very much. Let me just really say, honorable members, honorable speaker, he's been with us throughout. We appreciate that. Let me just thank you for your participation and for you really taking our time to be present physically and also mentally into this process. I think, Trudy and Professor Erasmus, it's a shared feeling that this has been an insightful session, and honorable members are calling for more engagement in this regard, which we'll discuss beyond this session. To conclude, I'd like to mention a few takeaways that would serve to strengthen further interventions within member parliaments' respective countries. First, you have underscored repeatedly that trade facilitation is a must for Africa. It is one of the most reliable ways to end poverty, to industrialize, to ensure competitiveness of our local industries. Secondly, the FCFTA is a golden opportunity to lift trade barriers, both tariff and non-tariff barriers. We must leverage on it to promote trade facilitation through our debates, through our questions, in our respective ways in our individual parliaments. Thirdly, members of parliament, it has been reiterated many times, you have a fundamental role to play to promote domestication of the AFCFTA through enabling laws and policies at national level. It was repeatedly indicated that without oversight by members of parliament on the agreement, the domestication thereof, as well as that of any related protocols, will be delayed. I also liked what Professor Erasmus said, that he said it in jest. We don't read newspapers, we read the real agreements. And I think for me, that's a real takeaway. Let us focus on the black and white in as far as our committee's deliberations are concerned, insofar as our oversight is concerned. Fourthly, we need to consider all instruments available, such as protocols under SADC and agreements made under COMESA, among others, and promote trade facilitation holistically together with the AFCFTA. Fifthly, we must continue to engage all stakeholders. That is part of our domestication representative role, be it civil society, be it consumer agencies, be it an oversight visit to some of our one-stop border posts and trade associations to promote Africa intra-trade. With these few words, Trudy and Professor Erasmus, colleagues, members of parliament, our interpreters, and Ronald in the background, making sure that with the interpreters, we're able to communicate. With this, have a good day. See you next time as we meet with TRALAC to strategize further in terms of how we can deepen our engagement. And before I let go, it would be remiss of me not to give an opportunity to the program manager for TIFI to say a few words, then we close the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, SG. I would just like to pass my gratitude to TRALAC for this training and for their responses each time we ask. And I'm hoping for further collaborations on these issues of trade, as we realize now that the trade wars are tightening, as we realize now that Africa has to stand up for itself. We have to come up with solutions that are African in nature and that speak to us, especially to us in the SADC region. With that, thank you, honorable members, colleagues, and staffs of parliament for joining this training. We hope to see you again in the next training. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nati. Thank you for delivering on this important outcome. With that, admin kindly take